They say scars tell a story, but the one on her face, that scar warned you not to ask. She showed up on Caleb Thorne's ranch the day the wind howled like wolves and the pipes froze solid in their sleeves. A woman with eyes like rain-soaked soil and a long, angry scar that carved down her cheek like lightning on dry earth. No one knew where she came from, and no one dared to ask why she walked like she'd seen fire and survived it. Caleb didn't want help. Hell, he didn't want company. His cattle were dying, his fences were snapping under frost, and the only thing colder than the wind was the silence in his house since his wife passed. But when he saw her hands on that calf steady, warm, whispering things that ain't no vet ever wrote down, he felt something shift. Not just in the animal, but in himself. Folks in town still say they saw her chase off a pack of wolves with nothing but a lantern. And that scar, say she brought a bull back from death's door using herbs and a prayer. Some think she's cursed. Others think she's a miracle walking barefoot through frost. Me, I think she came to save him, and maybe save herself, too. What do you think? Is this woman a healer, a ghost, or something in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear every theory, every goosebump. Don't hold back. The prairie never does. The wind, a razor honed on the vast, unforgiving sweep of the Texas Panhandle, had howled for 3 days straight, driving snow into drifts that buried fence lines and choked the narrow passes. It was a winter that gnawed at the spirit, mirroring the bleakness that had settled deep in Caleb Thorne's bones since Martha passed. His ranch, the Circle T, once a source of gruff pride, now felt like a lead weight, its future as uncertain as the next blizzard. Hands were scarce. Good men were hard to find, harder to keep when whispers of a strange sickness thinning his herd began to circulate. What wasn't taken by the relentless cold seemed to succumb to this creeping ailment, leaving steers gaunt, glassy-eyed, and finally, still, Caleb Thorne was a man carved from the Panhandle grit itself, weathered, solitary, his heart barricaded behind a wall of stoic resolve, built even before grief had laid its permanent siege. He was a widower, going on 5 years. The silence in his sparsely furnished ranch house, a constant companion, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the mournful sigh of the wind. He was used to hardship, had been baptized in it. But this winter, this sickness, this felt different, like a final reckoning. It was into this maelstrom of snow and despair that Isabel Izzy Moreau appeared, a figure materializing from the swirling white as if conjured by the storm itself. She stood at his door, a threadbare wool shawl pulled tight around her, snow clinging to her eyelashes and dusting the prominent, jagged scar that ran from her left temple, across her cheekbone, to the corner of her mouth. It was an old scar, silvered with time, but it gave her otherwise unremarkable features a startling, almost fierce intensity. In one gloved hand, she clutched a worn carpet bag, from which peeked the corner of an old, faded silk scarf, perhaps lavender or rose beneath the grime, and a battered, leather-bound journal. Looking for work, Mr. she said, her voice surprisingly low and steady, carrying a faint, unplaceable accent beneath the weariness. Her eyes, a clear, observant gray, met his without flinching. Caleb, bundled in his sheepskin, had been about to head to the barn. He stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile her sudden appearance with the desolation outside. Women didn't just wander into the teeth of a panhandle blizzard miles from any real settlement. Not alone. Ain't got much work for anyone. Ma'am, he grunted, his gaze drawn, despite himself, to the stark line of her scar, and less to pay for it. I'm not particular about pay, she replied, a shiver finally betraying her, as a gust of wind tore around the corner of the house. Food and a roof would be a start. I can cook, Mend. Clean. I'm good with animals. He hesitated. Desperation was a hard taskmaster. His cook, a grumpy old cowhand named Jed, was barely capable of boiling water without scorching it. And the mending pile in the bunkhouse was a testament to neglect. And good with animals. God knew he needed that. Yet, every instinct honed by years of solitude and caution screamed at him. A lone woman, appearing out of nowhere, marked as she was. Got hands already, he said, though two had quit just last week, spooked by the dying cattle and the endless, soul-crushing labor. An extra pair, even a woman's, might not go amiss in a place this size, with winter settling in like it means to stay forever. She countered quietly, her gaze sweeping over the snow-swept yard. The beleaguered barn. Caleb grunted again, a sound of reluctant consideration. He was down to 3 aging hands. Jet, who mostly complained. Young Billy, barely old enough to shave and more hindrance than help. And Silas, quiet and competent, but worn down by the sheer volume of work. He was, in truth, desperate. Bunkhouse is rough. Food's plain. I've known rough. I've known plain, she said, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. From her bag, she pulled a small, drawstring pouch made of soft leather. It smelled faintly of dried herbs, a scent both earthy and strangely exotic that cut through the sharp bite of the cold. He made his decision, curt and grudging. All right, tack room off the main barn. There's a cot? Jed'll show you. But any trouble? There won't be trouble from me. Mr. Thorne, Caleb Thorne. Izzy Moreau, she offered, a slight inclination of her head. The other hands reacted to Izzy's arrival with a mixture of slack-jawed surprise and deep-seated suspicion. Jeed, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and disapproval, muttered about women being bad luck on a struggling ranch. Billy stared, open-mouthed, at her scar whenever he thought she wasn't looking. Silas, true to his nature, said nothing, but his eyes followed her with a wary watchfulness. They took to calling her the scarred woman, or, when they felt bolder, the bad omen woman, their whispers following her like shadows. Izzy seemed oblivious, or perhaps immune, to their conjectures. She moved into the small, cold tack room, her few belongings, the carpet bag, the journal, the pouch of herbs, and the faded silk scarf which she sometimes wore tied around her throat, taking up little space. She worked tirelessly, her days a quiet rhythm of mending clothes, scrubbing floors, and preparing meals that, to everyone's surprise, were a marked improvement on Jed's greasy offerings. She spoke little, her answers to direct questions brief and to the point, offering no information about her past, how she'd come to be alone in a blizzard, or the story behind her scar. It was her way with the animals that truly set her apart and deepened the men's unease. She seemed to possess an almost preternatural sensitivity to their suffering. Caleb would see her in the barn, not just tending to the dwindling flock of chickens or the milk cow, but standing silently before the stalls of the 6 steers, her head cocked as if listening to something beyond their rasping breaths. He saw her murmur to them, soft, unintelligible words that sounded like no language he knew. Perhaps the Old French her name suggested. She'd run a gentle hand over their dull coats, her touch light, her gray eyes filled with a profound, sorrowful understanding. He once saw her press her ear to a steer's heaving flank, her own face tight with concentration, as if deciphering a message in the labored rhythm of its failing heart. The sickness in the herd continued its grim march. Each morning brought the discovery of another steer lost, its carcass quickly dragged away to be burned before it could further contaminate the others. Hope was a dwindling commodity on the Circle T. One evening, the storm that had brought Izzy returned with renewed ferocity, wind and snow lashing the ranch in a white fury. Young Billy stumbled into the cookhouse, his face pale. It's that little calf, Mr. Thorne, the one from Betsy. Ain't gonna make it. Just lying there, barely breathing. Caleb's jaw tightened. Betsy's calf, born late in the season, had been a small, fragile thing from the start. Another loss. He was tired of loss. Leave it be, Billy, he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Nothing to be done. Nature taking its course. He couldn't afford to waste precious resources or sentiment on a creature already marked for death. Later that night, unable to sleep, the wind clawing at the ranch house like a hungry beast, Caleb found himself drawn to the barn. The main area was dark and silent, save for the restless shifting of the remaining cattle and the roar of the storm outside. But from the small, isolated stall where the dying calf lay, a faint, flickering light emanated. He moved cautiously, his boots silent on the packed earth floor. Peering through a crack in the stall door, he saw Izzy. She had a single lantern, casting long, dancing shadows. The calf lay on a bed of clean straw, looking even smaller and more fragile than before. Izzy was kneeling beside it, her expression one of intense concentration. She had her leather-bound journal open on the straw beside her, its pages filled with spidery script and intricate drawings of plants. She was gently massaging the calf's tiny, cold hooves, her touch surprisingly firm. A thick, dark poultice, smelling of damp earth and a strange, pungent herb he couldn't identify, was spread across the calf's chest, held in place by strips of cloth torn from what looked like an old underskirt. She had wrapped the calf in a worn but clean horse blanket and was murmuring to it, those soft, flowing sounds, words he recognized now as French, old and formal, like a prayer or an incantation. Her scar, in the lantern light, seemed less a mark of violence and more a line of ancient knowledge, of sorrows seen and endured. Caleb watched, a strange mixture of skepticism and an even stranger, unacknowledged flicker of hope warring within him. He'd seen countless animals die. He knew the signs. This calf was beyond saving. Yet, Izzy worked with a quiet, desperate tenderness, a focused intensity that held the storm itself at bay. He saw her dip her fingers into a small tin of salve from her herb pouch and gently rub it onto the calf's gums. He backed away silently, unnoticed, a profound unease settling over him. This woman, with her scar and her secrets, her strange remedies and whispered French, was unlike anyone he had ever known. She was tending to a lost cause, yet she did so with the devotion of a mother tending a sick child. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, pristine and blindingly white under a pale sun. Caleb, expecting to tell Billy to dispose of the calf's body, walked into the barn. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the stall, wobbling on unsteady legs but undeniably alive, was Betsy's calf. Its eyes were brighter, its breathing easier. Izzy was beside it, offering a little warmed milk in a shallow bowl. Her face tired but serene. The poultice was gone, the blanket removed. The only signs of the night's vigil were the lingering scent of herbs and the quiet miracle standing before him. Izzy looked up, met Caleb's stunned gaze. He has a strong will, this little one. Monsieur Thorne, she said softly. Sometimes that is all it takes, a strong will and a little help to find its way back. Caleb Thorne, a man who hadn't believed in miracles for a very long time, could only stare. The stranger with the scar had not only defied a panhandle blizzard, but it seemed she had also, for one small, fragile life, defied death itself and the mystery of who Isabel Moreau truly was and what she was capable of deepened like the winter snows around them. The improbable revival of Betsy's calf echoed through the frigid air of the Circle T with more potency than any gunshot. It didn't dispel the fear that clung to the ranch like the relentless frost, but it wove a new thread into the grim tapestry, a hesitant, almost fearful curiosity about Isabelle Moreau. The hands still eyed her askance, their whispers now tinged with an odd uncertainty rather than simple disdain. Jed, the old cook, even grunted something that might have been grudging approval when she served up a rabbit stew that actually tasted of rabbit. Not just grease and despair, Izzy, for her part, seemed unchanged by the small miracle she had wrought. She moved through her days with the same quiet diligence, her scar a silent testament to some unknown history. Her attention, once the basic chores of the household were done, remained fixed on the suffering animals. Not long after the calf, Caleb's best cutting horse, a usually spirited buckskin named Dusty, pulled up lame, a nasty swelling blooming above his front fetlock. Caleb had examined it with a sinking heart, recognizing the telltale heat and pain that often meant weeks of rest. If not a permanent weakness, he'd resigned himself to losing the horse's invaluable work for a critical part of the winter. He found Izzy in Dusty's stall later that day. She had a poultice of crushed bark. Willows, he thought, from the scent, mixed with some dark, pungent herbs from her seemingly inexhaustible pouch, spread thick on a strip of clean linen. She was carefully binding the horse's leg, her touch firm yet incredibly gentle, her low voice murmuring those soft French cadences that sounded more like a song than speech. Dusty, normally impatient and head-shy with injury, stood remarkably still under her ministrations, his ears pricked, his intelligent eyes fixed on her face. Caleb watched from the shadows of the barn aisle, the familiar skepticism warring with a reluctant admiration. He'd seen plenty of poultices in his time. Most were just messy, wishful thinking. A few days later, Dusty was putting weight on the leg. Within a week, the swelling was nearly gone, the heat diminished. Izzy would unwrap the binding each evening, inspect the leg with a focused intensity, reapply her concoction, and rebind it. Her movements economical and sure. She never proclaimed success, never sought praise. She simply did what she did, her secrets held close in her capable fingertips. It wasn't just the direct healing that drew Caleb's attention. He began to notice her wider observations. One blustery afternoon, he saw her standing near the new well he'd had drilled the previous summer, a considerable expense meant to solve their perennial water shortages. She wasn't looking at the wellhead itself, but at the sparse, struggling vegetation in a wide circle around it. She knelt, crumbling the dry soil between her fingers, examining the stunted blades of grass, the unhealthy pallor of the few hardy weeds that clung to life there. Later, as she served him his solitary supper of beans and biscuits in the main house, a task she'd taken over from Jed with quiet efficiency, she spoke, her voice hesitant but clear. "Monsieur Thorne, the water. From the new well. Have you noticed the plants around it?" Caleb grunted. "Dry year. Winter's hard on everything." "Perhaps," she said, her gaze steady. "But the plants there, they seem more distressed than those near the old creek bed. Even where the water is low, they are déséquilibrés, unbalanced. The earth itself feels tired there." She paused. "The cattle that drink primarily from that well, are they the ones most afflicted by the sickness?" He stared at her. He'd never made that connection. The sickness had seemed so random, so pervasive. But now, thinking back, the steers in the north pasture, the ones closest to the new well, had indeed been the hardest hit. He'd put it down to exposure, to some quirk of the wind. He'd never considered the water itself, touted as pure and clean by the well drillers. The idea that this expensive new source of life could be a source of death was a chilling thought. But her observation, so acute, so tied to the subtle language of the land, planted a seed of doubt about his own assumptions. He found himself watching her more closely after that, a silent, almost furtive observer of her quiet routines. He'd catch glimpses of her through the dusty panes of the ranch house window or from the hayloft. He saw her one evening, after the hands had retired to the dubious comforts of the bunkhouse, standing in the corral with Martha's old mare, Bess, who was growing frail with age. Izzy wasn't doing anything, just standing beside the horse, her hand resting on its neck, her head bowed as if in shared confidence. Then, softly, a melody drifted across the frozen yard, a simple, poignant lullaby sung in that old French. It was a song of such profound tenderness that it made an old, forgotten ache stir in Caleb's chest. He'd seen her press her forehead to an ailing animal's brow, as if trying to absorb its pain or impart some of her own quiet strength. And once, hidden by a stack of poorly piled firewood, he witnessed a moment that shook his hardened composure. A newborn calf, one of the sickly ones, had finally succumbed despite Izzy's hushed efforts over 2 days. She had knelt beside the small, still form for a long time. When she finally rose, Caleb saw the glint of tears on her cheeks, catching the pale afternoon light. She hadn't wept for the loss of her efforts, he realized, but for the small life itself, for the pain it had endured. This stranger, who asked for nothing and endured the suspicions of his men, felt the ranch's sorrows as keenly, perhaps more keenly, than he did himself. Her leather-bound journal became an object of intense curiosity for him, though he would never have admitted it, nor dared to touch it. He'd seen her writing in it by the faint light of her lantern in the tack room, her brow furrowed in concentration. Once, when she'd left it briefly on the tack room bench while fetching water, he'd caught a glimpse of an open page. It was filled with dense, spidery handwriting in that same old French, interspersed with exquisitely detailed drawings of plants, roots, and flowers, their names carefully noted. Beside some entries were what looked like recipes, lists of ingredients and instructions, and often small, almost coded symbols. He remembered her mentioning her grandmother. This journal, he suspected, was a legacy, a repository of knowledge passed down, perhaps the formulas from her grandmother, who lived with Native Americans that the wind seemed to whisper about her origins when he let his mind wander. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. A woman holding such old, perhaps even sacred, knowledge was a dangerous thing in the eyes of many. The unease among the remaining hands festered. Young Billy, impressionable and superstitious, began to openly voice the fear that Izzy was more than just a good hand with animals. "She's a witch, I tell ya," he'd whisper to Jed in the bunkhouse, his eyes wide, talking to them critters in that devil language, mixing potions. "It ain't natural, what she does." Jed, though initially skeptical, started to nod along, his own discomfort growing with each unexplained recovery. The breaking point came when Silas, the quietest of them, saw Izzy in the barn with one of the prize breeding cows, one that had been listless and refusing to eat. She had one hand laid gently on the cow's broad chest, the other on its head, her eyes closed, her lips moving in a silent, fervent prayer or incantation. The sight was too much for Silas. He packed his meager belongings that same afternoon. "I ain't stayin' on a ranch that harbors witches." Thorne, he'd stated flatly, his face pale and set. "No offense to you, but that woman, she ain't right." He'd ridden off without a backward glance, leaving Caleb, another man, short, the whispers now amplified by an empty bunk. Caleb felt the pressure mounting. The community, small and tight-knit as it was, would hear the rumors. A scarred woman, a healer of uncanny ability, whispers of witchcraft. It was a volatile mix. His own carefully constructed, solitary world was being shaken to its foundations. Yet, when he looked at Izzy, at her quiet dignity, her unwavering compassion for his suffering animals, the undeniable results of her care. He couldn't bring himself to send her away. The alternative, a ranch slowly dying, his spirit eroding with it, was a far more terrifying prospect. A few days after Silas left, his prize, Hereford bull, old Brutus, a magnificent animal worth more than half the remaining herd, went down hard with the sickness. Its breath came in ragged gasps. Its massive frame trembled. Its eyes were dull with approaching death. Jed and Billy just shook their heads. Nothing for it. Caleb. He's a goner. Caleb stood over the stricken animal, a cold knot of despair in his gut. This was it. If Brutus died, the heart of his breeding stock was gone. He thought of Izzy, of the revived calf, the mended horse. He thought of her quiet confidence, the secrets in her fingertips. He was a pragmatic man, not given to flights of fancy or desperate gambles. But he was also a man pushed to the very edge. He found Izzy cleaning the chicken coop, her movements methodical. "The bull," he said, his voice gruff, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "Old Brutus. He's down. Bad." She straightened, her gray eyes meeting his, reading the unspoken plea beneath his harsh tone. She simply nodded. "I will see to him. Monsieur Thoron." He didn't offer assistance. He didn't question her methods. He didn't even watch. This time, he just walked away, leaving her to her strange, silent work, the fate of his most valuable animal, perhaps the fate of his entire ranch, resting in the hands of the scarred stranger. He told himself it was a fool's hope. But as he sat alone in his cold house, listening to the wind mock his fading fortunes, a tiny, traitorous ember of that hope refused to be extinguished. He was allowing this, sanctioning it, and with that silent permission, another layer of his own carefully guarded wall began to crumble. Old Brutus, the Hereford bull that carried the future of the Circle T in his massive, now failing, frame, lay like a fallen monarch in the largest stall of the barn. His ragged breathing was a bellows fanning the embers of Caleb Thorne's dwindling hope. Doc Miller, the veterinarian from over in Dalhart, a man whose pronouncements were usually as blunt and unforgiving as the winter wind, had made the ride out, taken one look, prodded, listened, and then delivered his verdict with a grim shake of his head. "Lungs are filling." "Caleb," Miller had said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag, his face etched with the weariness of too many lost battles against this insidious cattle sickness. "Same thing that's taken the others. There's naught I can do. Poultices and prayers won't touch this. Best to make it quick. Spare him the suffering." Caleb had nodded, a numb despair settling in. He'd known, deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud, by a man of medicine, felt like a final nail. He'd thanked Miller, paid him for his time and grim news, and then stood alone in the barn, the silence heavy with the bull's labored gasps. It was then that Izzy Moreau appeared at his elbow, as quiet as a shadow, her presence a disconcerting comfort. "Monsieur Thorns," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through his bleak reverie. "The veterinarian. He sees with his eyes, with his instruments. But there are other ways of seeing, other ways of listening." Her gaze was fixed on the ailing Brutus, a profound empathy softening the sharp line of her scar. "Give me 2 days. 2 days. And the shelter of this stall. Let me try." Caleb looked at her, at the unwavering resolve in her gray eyes. 2 days. Against Doc Miller's certainty, against the relentless march of the disease. It was madness. Yet, he thought of the revived calf, of Dusty's miraculously healed leg. What did he have to lose now? Beyond a sliver of pride and 2 more days of false hope. "He's worth more than this whole damn ranch put together." "Izzy," he said, his voice rough. I know his value." "Monsieur," she interrupted gently, "but it is his life, his breath, that I will fight for, not his price." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission she needed. For the next 48 hours, the stall housing old Brutus became Izzy's world. She erected a makeshift shelter within it, using old tarpaulins and horse blankets to create a smaller, warmer enclosure against the biting cold that seeped through the barn's timbers. She kept a small, pot-bellied stove burning just outside it, carefully tended, radiating a meager but vital warmth. Caleb saw her heating smooth, dark stones in the embers, stones she must have gathered from the creek bed in fairer weather. He found himself drawn to the barn at all hours. A reluctant sentinel, he'd see her through a gap in the tarpaulin, her silhouette moving with tireless grace in the dim lantern light. She was a whirlwind of quiet, focused activity. He saw her massaging Brutus's massive chest and along his spine with a rhythmic pressure, her strong fingers seeking out points he couldn't fathom, her brow furrowed in intense concentration, an ancient art of touch, of coaxing life back into sluggish channels. She'd wrap the heated stones in thick cloth and lay them along the bull's flanks, the gentle, penetrating warmth seeming to ease his trembling. She brewed concoctions from her endless supply of dried herbs, the air in the barn becoming thick with strange, earthy, and not unpleasant aromas. These she would gently coax Brutus to drink, or apply as warm compresses to his congested chest. And she sang, or rather, she chanted, in that old, melodic French. It wasn't a song of entertainment, but something deeper, a ritual of sound, a lullaby, as she later haltingly explained to him, that her grandmother had taught her, a way to soothe the spirit of a suffering creature, to align its will with the forces of healing, to calm its fear of the encroaching darkness. It was a sound that resonated with something ancient and profound, something that spoke to the marrow of existence. And Caleb, listening from the shadows, felt an unfamiliar stirring, a sense of something sacred unfolding in the heart of his dusty, dying ranch. The first night of Izzy's vigil was shattered by a different kind of terror. A lean, desperate winter had driven the plains wolves closer to human habitation than usual. Sometime in the dead of night, their howls, a mournful chorus in the distance, suddenly sharpened, growing closer, punctuated by the panicked bleating of the calves in their pen near the south fence. Caleb was roused by the commotion, grabbing his rifle as he stumbled from his bed. But Izzy, her senses seemingly attuned to every whisper of distress on the ranch, was already there. When Caleb, followed by a sleepy, fumbling Jed and Billy, reached the calf pen, they were met by a scene from a frontier nightmare. Two gaunt wolves were inside the breached fence line, another snarling at the gap, and between them and the terrified, huddled calves stood Izzy Moreau, a flaming torch, a piece of wood hastily lit from Brutus's warming stove, held high in one hand, her other arm protectively outflung towards the small creatures behind her. Her face, illuminated by the wild, dancing flames, was a mask of fierce determination, her scar livid in the firelight. She was shouting at the wolves, not in French this time, but in a raw, primal language of defiance, her voice cracking but resolute. The wolves, momentarily startled by the fire and the unyielding figure before them, snarled and snapped, but held their ground, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers. "Get back, you devils," she cried, taking a step forward, thrusting the torch towards the nearest wolf, which recoiled with a yelp as sparks showered its muzzle. Caleb raised his rifle, fired a shot into the air. The blast echoed through the frozen night. The wolves, already unnerved by Izzy's stand and the approaching men, hesitated, then turned and vanished like gray ghosts into the darkness. Izzy stood, panting, the torchlight casting her long, wavering shadow over the snow. The calves, though trembling, were unharmed. She slowly lowered the torch, her shoulders slumping slightly, the adrenaline ebbing, Caleb walked towards her, his own heart still pounding. He saw a raw scrape on her forearm, where she must have caught it on the splintered fence rail. "You all right, Izzy?" he asked, his voice hoarser than usual. She nodded, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face with a trembling, soot-stained hand. "The little ones. They are safe." Her gaze went to the mended fence, then back to the barn where Brutus lay. Her duty, it seemed, was multifaceted tonight. The next day, as Izzy continued her quiet, unwavering vigil over the bull, another kind of predator arrived. A man named Henderson, a well-dressed, sharp-eyed investor from Fort Worth who'd heard tales of Caleb's dwindling fortunes and quality stock, rolled up in a smart buggy. He wasn't interested in the sickly herd, but his eye fell on Dusty, Izzy's first triumph, now sound and moving with his old grace in the corral. Henderson made an offer for Dusty, a generous one, enough to pay off a significant chunk of Caleb's mounting debts, enough to buy feed, perhaps even hire another hand. Caleb felt a pang of temptation, sharp and immediate. It was a practical solution, a lifeline. Dusty was just a horse, after all, albeit a fine one. Business was business. He found Izzy preparing a mash for Brutus. "Man here wants to buy Dusty," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral, offering a good price, a very good price. Izzy stopped what she was doing, her back to him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she turned, her gray eyes blazing with an intensity that startled him. Her scar seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "By Dusty," she repeated, her voice low, vibrating with a barely suppressed fury. "Monsieur Thorne, that horse." I felt his bones, his tendons. I breathed with him when his own breath was shallow. He is not a sack of grain to be traded. He is not a machine for profit. Her hands clenched at her sides. He trusted me. He allowed my touch when he was in pain. You would sell that trust. You would sell a life that fought its way back from the brink. For coin. Her voice cracked. He once breathed because I willed it, because I shared my own small strength. I cannot, I will not, stand by and see him sold like a piece of unfeeling property. Caleb was taken aback by her vehemence. He'd expected reluctance, perhaps a quiet plea, but not this raw, passionate defense. He saw not just a healer, but a fierce protector, a woman whose connection to these animals transcended mere caretaking. It was something deeper, something akin to kinship. He looked at her, at the righteous anger that made her almost beautiful in her defiance, and the cold, practical calculus of his debts seemed suddenly shabby, diminished. Martha would have understood this woman. He thought with a sudden, sharp pang. He thought of the way Izzy had stood against the wolves, a lone woman with a torch, her body a shield for his calves. He thought of her tireless devotion to Brutus, fighting a battle everyone else had conceded. He thought of the way she had wept for a lost calf. He turned away from her, then, and walked out to where Henderson waited, puffing on a cigar. "Horse ain't for sale, Henderson," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Not now, not ever." He ignored the man's sputtered protests and walked back towards the barn, a strange lightness in his step, despite the weight of his unresolved debts. On the morning of the third day, Caleb entered Brutus's stall with a heavy heart, expecting the worst. Izzy was asleep, slumped against the stall wall, her face pale with exhaustion in the gray dawn light, her journal fallen open beside her, and Old Brutus was standing, unsteadily. Yes, his massive frame still gaunt, but he was on his feet. His head was up, and as Caleb watched, scarcely daring to breathe, the bull let out a low, resonant moose, a sound of life, not of death. Izzy stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw Brutus, saw Caleb, and a slow, tired smile touched her lips, illuminating her face, softening the harsh line of her scar until it was merely a part of her unique landscape. He chose life. "Monsieur," she whispered, with a little encouragement. Later that day, when Jed and Billy saw old Brutus take his first shaky steps out into the winter sunlight, when they saw him drink deep from the water trough and then, incredibly, begin to nibble at a handful of hay, Izzy offered. Their skepticism finally, irrevocably, shattered. Young Billy just stared, his jaw agape. Jed cleared his throat, spat, and then actually tipped his hat towards Izzy. Reckon you got the touch. Ma'am," he mumbled, a flush rising on his weathered neck. A healing touch. For true, Caleb Thorne said nothing. But as he watched Izzy gently stroke the bull's broad forehead, a new, unfamiliar warmth spread through his own chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the pale winter sun. The sickness, the fangs of the wolves, the doubts of men. They had all tested the fabric of the Circle T and the scarred stranger in its midst. And somehow, through it all, a fragile, tenacious hope had not only survived, but had begun to take root. What did you think of today's story? If it made your day, drop a good in the comments. If it didn't hit the mark, just type 1. Got your own thoughts? I'd love to hear them below. And hey, don't forget to hit subscribe. It's free, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for being here. The full recovery of old Brutus, an event that resonated through the sparse, winter-bound community with the force of a minor legend, didn't magically transform the Circle T into a haven of easy acceptance, but it did shift something fundamental in the atmosphere, like the first, almost imperceptible thaw after a long freeze. The remaining hands, Jed and young Billy, now looked at Isabel Moreau not with fear, but with a kind of rough, bewildered respect, the whispers of which faded, replaced by murmurs of her having a knowing hand or being blessed with a gift for critters. More significantly, the wall of silence between Caleb Thorne and Izzy began to erode, worn down by shared anxieties and small, hard-won triumphs. Their conversations, initially sparse and strictly practical, started to meander into more personal territory. It began, naturally enough, with the animals. They'd discuss the lingering cough of a particular steer, the skittishness of a new filly, the best way to mend a broken fence in the frozen earth. Caleb found himself listening, truly listening, to her quiet observations, her voice often laced with that soft, old-world French when she spoke of the subtleties of an animal's spirit. From there, the path led, cautiously, to other losses, other cares. One evening, as they sat in the main ranch house, a rare moment of shared stillness after a long day, Caleb found himself speaking of Martha, his late wife. The words came haltingly at first, rusty from disuse, but Izzy listened with a quiet intensity that invited confidence. He spoke of Martha's laughter, the way she could make even the harshest panhandle winter feel less desolate, the small garden she'd tried to coax from the unyielding soil. He didn't speak of the pain of her loss. That was still a private, jagged thing, but of the empty spaces she'd left behind. Izzy, in turn, offered fragments of her own past. She spoke of her grandmother, the woman who had filled the leather-bound journal with her spidery French script and intricate drawings of herbs. "My grand-mère Lisette," she'd said, her gaze distant, fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. She learned much from the first people, where she lived when she was young. They taught her that every plant, every creature, has a spirit, a purpose, that healing is not just about mending the body, but about restoring balance, about listening to what the earth and the heart are trying to say. She also spoke, obliquely, of those her grandmother, and she herself, had tried to save but couldn't. Sometimes, the spirit is too weary, Monsieur Thorne's, or the imbalance too great. We are only facilitators. We cannot command life. We can only invite it, encourage its return. Her words, spoken with a gentle fatalism, resonated with Caleb's own unspoken griefs, his own private tally of failures. He understood, perhaps better than she knew, the burden of those they couldn't save. One afternoon, Caleb entered the tack room, now more Izzy's sanctuary than a mere storage space, to ask about a new salve she was brewing. He found her with her back to him, by the small, cracked mirror she'd tacked to the wall, her faded silk scarf, the one she usually wore knotted loosely around her throat, or sometimes, on colder days, partially veiling the lower half of her face, lay on the small table beside her. She was tracing the line of her prominent scar with a fingertip, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she tensed, clearly thinking she was alone, perhaps about to retie the scarf. Caleb felt an impulse to turn away, to grant her privacy, but something held him. He'd seen the scar countless times. It was as much a part of her as her quiet voice or her steady gray eyes. He cleared his throat softly. She started, her hand dropping from her face, her eyes meeting his in the mirror, a flicker of, not shame, but perhaps vulnerability, in their depths. Before she could reach for the scarf, Caleb spoke, his voice rougher than he intended, yet carrying an undercurrent of something akin to gruff tenderness. No need for that, Izzy, not anymore. There's nothing left here that needs hiding. A slow blush, faint as a prairie sunrise, rose on her cheeks, a startling contrast to the silvery line of the scar. She didn't pick up the scarf. She simply met his gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an understanding that some barriers, once lowered, need not be raised again. Their slowly growing accord, however, was not mirrored by the wider world. One frigid Saturday, when Caleb had driven Izzy into the small township of Redemption for supplies, he decided on a rare indulgence, a hot meal at the Prairie Rose Diner. They'd barely settled into a booth when the proprietor, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Henderson, approached, her arms crossed, her expression pinched. "Caleb," she said, pointedly ignoring Izzy, "I'm afraid I can't serve your companion." She gestured vaguely towards Izzy. "She's, making some of the other customers uncomfortable. Her gaze flickered to Izzy's scar. Izzy went very still, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Caleb felt a cold fury rise within him, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he possessed in such measure. He looked around the diner. A few patrons were indeed staring, whispering behind their hands. He saw not curiosity, but a mean-spirited judgment. Without a word, Caleb Thorne stood up. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached down, took Izzy's unresisting hand, her skin surprisingly cold, and gently pulled her to her feet. Then, still silent, his face a stony mask that dared anyone to comment, he led her out of the diner, leaving Mrs. Henderson sputtering and a stunned silence in their wake. It was the first time he had publicly, unequivocally, taken her side. His action a clear, defiant statement. He didn't speak as they walked back to the wagon, but his grip on her hand was firm. A silent apology, a silent reassurance. The rumors about Izzy's unnatural healing abilities eventually reached the ears of officialdom. A county health inspector, a officious young man named Peters, arrived at the Circle T one blustery morning, armed with a clipboard and an air of self-importance. He'd heard tales, he announced, of irregular veterinary practices, of folk magic being used on livestock, potentially endangering the food supply. He clearly expected to find some cackling crone brewing potions over an open fire. Caleb met him calmly. When Peters demanded to see Izzy, Caleb led him to the tack room, where she was meticulously grinding herbs with a small mortar and pestle. Instead of defensiveness, Caleb simply gestured to Izzy's leather-bound journal, which lay open on her small work table. "This is how she works. Mr. Peters," Caleb said. Her grandmother's knowledge, notes, observations, remedies passed down, all written out. She keeps careful records. Izzy, understanding the situation, quietly offered the inspector her journal. Peters, looking somewhat deflated by the lack of overt witchcraft, reluctantly flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed at the old French and the detailed botanical drawings. While he did, Caleb, with a poker face, offered him a cup of tea. "Izzy's own blend," he said. "Good for settling the stomach and the nerves." The inspector, caught off guard, accepted. He sipped the fragrant herbal tea, his eyes still scanning the journal. Whether it was the tea, the undeniable evidence of methodical record-keeping, or the quiet dignity of Izzy herself, Peters's officiousness began to wane. He asked a few perfunctory questions, which Izzy answered simply and directly. Finally, he closed the journal, cleared his throat, and announced that he found no immediate cause for concern, though he advised Caleb to ensure all practices remained within accepted county guidelines. He left without writing a single citation, a small victory that tasted surprisingly sweet. In the quiet days that followed, a new creature found its way into their shared orbit. A scrawny, feral cat, one of its back legs hanging limp and useless, began to appear at the edge of the barn, its eyes wide with hunger and fear. It was a creature of the shadows, as wary and wounded as Izzy herself had once seemed. Jed and Billy shooed it away, but Izzy began leaving out scraps of food. Slowly, patiently, she coaxed it closer. Caleb watched, saying nothing, as she eventually managed to gently examine its injured leg. Together, in unspoken agreement, they began to care for the creature. Izzy fashioned a tiny splint from twigs and cloth. Applying a soothing salve to the mangled limb, Caleb built a small, sheltered box for it in a warm corner of the barn. It was a skittish, difficult patient, hissing and spitting, but they persevered. Izzy named it Pilgrim because, she said softly to Caleb one evening, as they watched the cat tentatively lap milk from a saucer, "Like some of us, he is on a long journey, searching for a safe harbor." The symbolism was not lost on Caleb. This small, broken creature, finding solace and healing through their combined efforts, felt like a reflection of their own tentative, evolving connection. Winter was beginning to loosen its icy grip, the days growing marginally longer, the sun holding a hint more warmth. The ranch, thanks in large part to Izzy's tireless efforts, was slowly pulling back from the brink. The cattle sickness had abated, and the remaining herd, though smaller, was healthy. Old Brutus was regaining his strength, a testament to Izzy's skill and devotion. One evening, as the last light painted the vast sky in hues of apricot and lavender, Caleb found Izzy by the corral fence, her gaze on the distant horizon. The faded silk scarf was, as it often was now, tucked into her pocket rather than around her throat. "Izzy," he said, his voice quiet, "this ranch, it wouldn't have made it through this winter without you." He paused, searching for the right words. "There's a place for you here, if you want it, a permanent place." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the conventional sense. It was an offering of sanctuary, of partnership, of a future shared. She turned to him, her gray eyes searching his face. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sigh of the evening wind. Her answer, when it came, was not a simple yes or no. "The journey, Monsieur Thorne," she said softly, "it is not yet over. For Pilgrim, or for me." It was an ambiguous reply, yet not a refusal. Later that night, for the first time since she had arrived like an apparition from the storm, Isabel Moreau sat by the main hearth in the ranch house, not on the rough stool she usually occupied, but in Martha's old rocking chair, which Caleb had silently pulled closer to the flames. Her dark hair, usually braided tightly or tucked away, was unpinned, falling softly around her shoulders, and the faded silk scarf lay forgotten on the table in her small tack room. She watched the fire, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips, the scar on her face softened by the warm's flickering light, no longer a mark of old wounds, but a testament to survival, and perhaps to the slow, cautious dawning of trust. The panhandle spring, when it finally broke the iron grip of winter, arrived not with a sudden fanfare, but as a slow, tentative unfurling. The relentless winds softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain instead of ice. The snow, which had seemed a permanent fixture, receded grudgingly from the plains, revealing a landscape weary but waiting. Patches of pale new grass, tenacious and hopeful, pushed through the thawing soil. The cottonwoods along the creek, skeletal for so long, began to shimmer with the faintest haze of green. And on the Circle T, the air, once thick with the chill of sickness and despair, began to hum with a fragile, resurgent life. New calves, sturdy and bright-eyed, gamboled in the warming sun, their mothers lowing contentedly. The insidious ailment that had decimated Caleb's herd seemed to have vanished with the last of the snows, as if Izzy's steadfast care and the turning of the season had finally cleansed the land. The ranch, which had teetered on the brink of ruin, breathed again. Izzy Moreau, too, seemed to blossom in the gentler light. The harshness of winter had etched lines of fatigue around her clear gray eyes, but now a quiet energy emanated from her. With Caleb's unspoken approval, she claimed a small, dilapidated shed near the old creek bed, a structure long abandoned to wind and neglect. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to transform it. She mended the roof, patched the walls, and cleared the overgrown weeds, her capable hands bringing order from decay. Jed and a now openly admiring Billy even pitched in, squaring up the doorframe and building a sturdy workbench inside. When it was done, Izzy hung a simple, hand-carved wooden sign above the door. It read, "Le refuge des oubliés," for the forgotten. It was to be a sanctuary, she explained quietly to Caleb, for any wild creature, injured or orphaned, that might need a moment of care, a safe haven before returning to the wild. Or, if that was not possible, a peaceful place to end its days. It was a testament to her spirit, a place born of her deep compassion for all things vulnerable. Pilgrim, the feral cat, now sleek and with only a slight limp to mark his past trauma, often sunned himself on its threshold, a living emblem of her purpose. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Izzy was tending to a young hawk with a broken wing inside her small refuge, the mail rider, making his infrequent stop at the Circle T, delivered a letter addressed to her. The envelope was of fine quality, the handwriting elegant but unfamiliar to Caleb, who'd handed it to her. He saw her stiffen slightly as she took it, her gaze fixed on the postmark, a town in eastern Louisiana, a world away from the stark plains of Texas. Later, he saw her sitting alone by the creek, the letter open in her lap, her face unreadable. She didn't speak of its contents for many days. Then, one evening, as they shared a quiet cup of her herbal tea on the ranch house porch, watching the prairie swallow the setting sun, she told him, "It is from my sister, Cécile," she said, her voice very low, her fingers tracing the faded pattern on the old silk scarf she now kept folded in her apron pocket, a memento rather than a shield. We have been estranged. For many years." She paused, the silence stretching. "There was a fire, a long time ago, at our family home. I was there." Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, near the scar. "Cécile. She could not forgive me for surviving, I think, or perhaps for what she imagined I had failed to do. Another silence. She writes now, to apologize, to ask me to come home. Caleb listened, his own heart aching with a sudden understanding of the deep, invisible wounds she carried. He didn't press, didn't pry. He simply sat with her in the gathering twilight, a silent witness to her pain and to her strength. Izzy didn't say if she would reply, or what that reply might be. The letter, like her past, remained a private country. The following Sunday, a day warm enough to feel like a genuine promise of summer, Caleb did something unexpected. He hitched the buckboard and asked Izzy if she would ride with him. He didn't say where they were going. They drove for a mile or so, away from the main ranch buildings, to a quiet, sun-dappled knoll shaded by a lone, ancient mesquite. There, beneath the tree, stood a simple, weathered stone marker, not a statue, but a carved headstone that simply read, "Martha Thorne, beloved wife, gone too soon, but never forgotten." Caleb stood before it for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his shoulders bowed. Izzy waited respectfully, her presence a quiet comfort. Then, he turned to her. From his pocket, he took a small, velvet-worn box. Inside, nestled on faded satin, was a simple, unadorned gold band. It wasn't Martha's wedding ring. That he kept in a locked drawer with her few other precious things. This was different. It was his grandmother's ring, a plain circlet that had seen generations of Thorne women on this land. He took Izzy's hand, her skin warm from the sun, her fingers strong and capable, and gently pressed the small box into her palm. "Izzy," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze meeting hers, direct and unwavering. "This land, it's a hard place. It takes a toll, but it can also give back. If you let it." He gestured towards the grave. "Martha!" She understood that. "She made this place a home for me." He looked back at Izzy, his heart in his eyes. "If someday, if you find you want to put down roots here, to truly make this your place, there's no need for promises, no need for grand words, just belief that a future can be built here, together." Tears welled in Izzy's eyes, blurring the stark landscape. She looked at the ring, then up at Caleb's earnest, vulnerable face. She didn't speak, but her fingers closed gently around the small box. Life on the ranch continued its rhythm of challenges and quiet rewards. One night, a young mare went into a difficult, prolonged labor. Caleb, Jed, and Billy worked tirelessly, but the foal was stubbornly positioned, the mare growing weaker, her distress palpable. Izzy was there, a calm, steady presence amidst the rising panic. Her hands, seemingly guided by an ancient instinct, worked alongside Caleb's, gently trying to shift the foal, her voice a constant, soothing murmur to the laboring mother. They were a team, their movements synchronized, their shared purpose a palpable force in the lamplit barn. Hours passed, the night bleeding into the exhausted gray of dawn, and then, finally, with a last, heroic effort from the mare and Izzy's skillful, guiding touch, the foal was born, small, damp, but alive, kicking feebly. A wave of profound relief washed through the barn. Jed let out a shaky whoop. Billy grinned, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Caleb looked at Izzy, her face pale with exhaustion, but shining with a luminous triumph. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm engulfing her smaller, equally work-worn one. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a world of unspoken emotion passed between them. Gratitude, respect, and something deeper, something tender and new. They stood like that for a long, breathless moment, their hands clasped, the miracle of new life, a fragile bond between them. the weariness forgotten. The seasons continued their gentle turning. The panhandle summer arrived, hot and dry, but the pastures of the Circle T remained green. The cattle fat and content, Izzy's refuge for the forgotten, housed a rotating cast of small, healing creatures. The letter from her sister lay unanswered in a small wooden box where Izzy kept her few treasures, but a measure of peace seemed to have settled in its place. One brilliant afternoon, Izzy stepped out onto the porch of the main ranch house. She had been helping Caleb mend a saddle, their conversation easy, punctuated by comfortable silences. The sun was warm on her face. Pilgrim, the cat, wound himself around her ankles, purring. In the distance, the new calves frolicked in the tall grass, their playful antics a joyful counterpoint to the vast, silent sky, a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of wildflowers and warm earth, stirred the wind chimes Caleb had hung from the eaves in Martha's memory. Their delicate music, a sound Izzy had come to love. Slowly, deliberately, Izzy Moreau raised her hands to her head. Her hair, now often worn loose, cascaded around her shoulders. She reached for the faded silk scarf that was no longer a constant companion, but sometimes still appeared, a habit of concealment dying hard. Today, however, she didn't tie it. Instead, she let it drop from her fingers, allowing it to flutter to the porch floor like a shed skin. She lifted her face to the sun, her eyes closed for a moment, her scar fully visible, no longer a mark of pain to be hidden, but simply a part of her, a line in the story of her life, bathed in the honest, unforgiving, yet ultimately healing light. She opened her eyes, and a soft, almost musical laugh escaped her lips, a sound as free and unrestrained as the prairie wind. It mingled with the chiming of the bells, a melody of newfound peace. Caleb Thorne, watching her from the doorway, felt his own heart lift. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it no longer mattered to anyone on the Circle T, or, indeed, to Izzy herself. No one truly saw the scar anymore. They saw only the quiet strength in her posture, the deep compassion in her gaze, the gentle peace that radiated from the woman who had, at long last, found her way home. And so, for now, we leave Caleb and Izzy's on the threshold of their new spring. What are your thoughts on their journey? Did Izzy's quiet strength and Caleb's slow thaw resonate with you? What do you imagine the future holds for them on the Circle T? And for Izzy, with the unanswered letter from her past? We would be truly grateful to hear your feelings and interpretations in the comments below. Your insights enrich these stories for our entire community of listeners and readers. If The Stranger and the Scar touched your heart or gave you a quiet moment of reflection, please consider giving this story a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll join us for many more tales from the Heartlands, stories of resilience, love, and the enduring human spirit. Your support helps us keep these narratives alive and allows us to continue bringing new chapters to you. Thank you for sharing this journey with us.